What up, Wizards? It's Devin Igby. He's down here, I promise. Did you guys know that World Championship 30 is coming up in less than a week? Hey, chicken, what's going on? Yeah, that's right. October the 25th. That's like 6 days from now. The whole shindig kicks off. There's $1 million in prizes on the line. In first place alone takes home $100K just for themselves. Can you imagine how much peanut butter you can buy with that? It's going to be a big week, especially considering we expect to see previews for Foundations around that same date. So a lot going on, and I'm excited for the previews, but honestly, I'm even more excited for the standard portion of this tournament here. We don't get a standard Worlds every single day of the calendar year, so this is going to be a big one. The format has evolved a good bit in the few weeks that we've had access to Dustmorn cards, and I really think that we're in a pretty diverse, lots of deck variants kind of standard right now, such that 12 to even 15 different decks could easily show up at this thing and do some damage. Not to mention, there might be like a completely new brew or two that shows up to the event. So there's a lot to look forward to here, like 20 different decks we could talk about, but we're going to try to focus down the microscope a little bit in this one and zero in on 5 decks that I think could win the whole thing. Let's go.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. Let's go ahead and get into it. I got a lot to cover today, but I should say that I'm going to bookend this video at numbers 5 and 1, both with decks that I think are picks for dark horse candidates. I'm not sure that these are sure shots to take down the entire tournament, grab that 100K, climb the ladder and grab the briefcase. But I do think that you'd be a fool to ignore either one of these decks. So let's start with one that I'm calling Handey Coordination, because I think that's a clever name for the deck. Can we name decks again? Because nowadays people are just calling this Azorius Oculus because that's the color combination and the most important card in the deck. Super boring. Can we name decks again? Anyway, in my opinion, this is the most frustrating deck in Standard to play against, far and away more irritating than a deck like Mono Red Leyline. So let's take a look at it. Here's this bad boy right here, and one thing I want to point out immediately is that I like that this is the kind of deck that you can see its game plan almost immediately. When it hits your screen, it's pretty obvious to see. You've got your Aborn Oculus, your Haughty Djinns, right? Those are huge men. Very large men they are, and you want to get them into your graveyard and then get them out with either Helping Hand or Recommission. So there's 6 different ways of very cheaply getting a very large person out of your graveyard in this deck, and that's basically the entire deck. But one thing I don't think this deck gets quite enough credit for, which is something you'll hear me say about different decks in this video a few times, is how versatile this game plan can actually be. Like, sure, there's a potential for a turn to Aborn Oculus. It is a line that's available to you, but the deck also knows that's not going to happen all the time. So you have to play a little bit later into the game, and the deck can do that. Later in the game, the deck's going to pretty routinely have, anywhere between 12 and 20 cards in its graveyard fairly reliably, and that means you can just cast Oculus. You've got things like Chart a Course to put things into your graveyard, which is pretty important, but there's plenty of other cards in this deck that do that as well. If you go down here to the instance, you see Moment of Truth, which will put cards in your graveyard as well. So a few choice ways of doing that in this deck, but this one uses a little bit more counter magic than the deck would sometimes use. It's got 3 copies of Phantom Interference, a 2-mana counterspell, and then 2 copies of 3 Steps Ahead, which you don't always see in this deck, but obviously plays really well with Oculus and Haughty Djinn because copying them is stupid. And of course, if you can discard cards to it, the catalog mode on this card, draw 2, discard 1, then that's just going to fuel your Oculus, your Djinn, whatever. But this deck does, again, play this like neat little tempo game plan some of the time. If it can't immediately do its thing, or if it didn't go first and it starts to get overwhelmed by creature-based decks, it's got Into the Flood Maw to get itself back into the game. It's got Soul Partition, plus just a copy of Get Lost to help with sort of removing stuff in the early game. Along with its counter spells, this deck can actually go fairly deep into the game, turn 4, turn 5, and then start turning things around in sort of a tempo way with Oculuses and, 6 powered Djinns and stuff. So again, I think a lot of people just look at this deck and they think like, oh, this is a turn 3 Reanimator deck where you're trying to get a huge guy and kind of get out ahead that way. And you can do that. That is a game plan available to it. But again, it also has a little bit of a longer game, more tempo-based game plan that I think that people should take a little bit more notice of. Now, Oculus is in a kind of interesting position because I don't think that too many people are going to be devoting that many sideboard slots to taking this deck down. There are some pretty good choices to use against it. Things like Ghost Vacuum pop up a lot, and cards like Anoint with Affliction can easily exile the Oculus to where they can't get it back with a Helping Hand or Recommission or whatever. So there's easy sideboarding against this deck, but at the same time, I don't think, again, that people are going to devote too many slots to it, and rather, they're going to devote slots to decks that they really think they need to take down. And I'm just not sure that Oculus is going to be as much on the radar as some of these other decks we'll look at today, so it may be able to sneak in and grab a win, but I would still only give this about a 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 chance of taking down the whole tournament. But top 8ing, I think that's extremely likely. Let's move on to deck number 4 here, and if you're doing the math right, you'll notice that decks number 4 through 2 are the ones that I think have the greatest shot of taking down this tournament. And this next one is the aggro boogeyman in the format right now. Is it mono red Leyline? Absolutely not. Is it perhaps Jeskai Imidane's Recruiter? No, it's not that deck, although I think it could show up, don't get me wrong. No, this time we're talking about GRL Aggro, which has very few green cards in the main deck, but the ones that it plays are really effective. Now here is a GRL Prowess list. This deck is built in a lot of different ways, and I'll talk about that in a second, but there's a lot of sort of auto includes like your Monastery Swift Spears, the classic mono red 1-drop for a deck just like this, but there's also Heartfire Hero. Arguably the most dangerous card in the entire deck. This one isn't doing any sort of, Callous Cell Sword tricks or anything, trying to sacrifice it, but doesn't necessarily have to win the game very quickly. Emberheart Challenger is a 4 of in this deck, a 2-mana 2/2 haste prowess with more text on it that lets you draw cards. Questing Druid also draws cards, triggers prowess and stuff like that, and then gets large over long games if it needs to. Slickshot is a 4 of in this build, but that is kind of where this deck branches off some of the time from other decks, is that this one plays 4 Slickshot, and sometimes you'll see people completely take Slickshot out of the deck and play, say, Picnic Ruiner instead. Manifold Mouse is just great, it turns out. You see more and more of this. It's ported over from the Just Mice list into the green-red lists and the red-black lists and stuff like that. So really, really sick thing right here. It turns out that Trample and Double Strike together are great, but either one by themselves turn out to be amazing as well. So aside from that, there's 4 Shocks, the only removal spell in the deck, but it can also go face and trigger prowess and stuff. Monstrous Rage is our best pump spell. Might of the Meek is our second best pump spell, and in this particular version of the deck, one of the only other pump spells that we play, but drawing a card is fantastic. And we usually control a mouse, so that +1/+0 is more or less inevitable. There's only 2 Snakeskin Veil in this deck. Sometimes you'll see as many as 4, and even then you'll see some Royal Treatments in the deck. Occasionally you'll see Audacity in this deck, but this particular version goes pretty light on green, only plays 2 copies of Snakeskin Veil, but it is a very important protection spell. Also triggers Valiant, Prowess, whatever. Innkeeper's Talent is in here. This is interesting with anything with Valiant, like again Emberheart Champion or Heartfire Hero, right? Because this counts as targeting them with an ability if you give them the +1/+1 counter. So they get really, really big as the game goes on, and it only takes a couple of turns for them to do so. You can also make them harder to target with the second ability, right? So there's a lot of really, really slick things about playing an Innkeeper's Talent, and it gives us a little bit more of a potential long game if we need to play it that way, while also triggering prowess and pseudo-prowess abilities like Slickshot. Again, millions of ways to build the deck, but the basic gist of it is something that we're all very familiar with at this point. Even if this deck doesn't take home the championship belt, it still has the solace of knowing that it is why Standard is the way it is, right? A lot of us are going to end up playing 4 copies of Cut Down, some number of Elspeth Smites, some Lay Down Arms, some Torch the Tower, a bunch of 1-mana removal spells, and a ton of 2-mana ones for that matter, right? And a lot of that is because this deck exists. And as Standard has adapted to this deck in multiple ways and warped around this deck has not gotten enough credit for evolving in the ways that it has had to over the last few weeks of the season, right? We started with mono red Leyline, then we started taking the Leylines out. We experimented with a red-white build with Shard Mage's Rescue. We landed on green-red, but even that deck has evolved a good bit. Do you play Picnic Ruiner or not? How many copies of Snakeskin Veil do you play? Do you even play Slickshot? So again, there's a lot of different ways to build this deck, and they are still sort of in contention right now for what is the correct quote-unquote way to build the deck. It's kind of tough to say this deck is a shoe-in or anything, but I really would not be surprised if it took home the top spot. So I'm going to give it, say, a 1 in 5 chance, because I think a lot of people are gunning for a deck like this, making sure that it's not going to finish too strongly. But again, given exactly the right weekend, 1 or 2 could slip past all of the opposing defenses and actually take a good spot. Now my number 3 is mono white, but it doesn't have to be mono white. It could be red white with Urabrass Forge, although we see less and less of that deck recently. More recently, we've been seeing a very very, very light black splash, right? We won't even see black cards in the main deck some of the time. It'll just be like 2 or 3 copies of Kaya Intangible Slayer in the sideboard as like the only black card. So again, this deck has been going through like sort of subtle evolutions throughout the season that it too does not get enough credit for. People think mono white is just Caretaker's Talent and Biza and some carrot cakes or whatever, but no, this deck has too been shifting a little bit here and there over the season. Mono white, mono white, mono white. This is another one that we're all pretty familiar with at this point that has evolved a good bit this season. You see the Bizas that you would expect to see. You see the Archangel Elspeth that'll help proc your Caretaker's Talent. There are Caretaker's Talent in the deck. We'll see it in a second. The Lay Down Arms is a 4 of. Sunfall still a 4 of. Get Lost still a 4 of. But apart from that, some innovation. You see the 2 main deck Lauren of the Third Path. This not only helps in mirror matches to take out other Caretaker's Talents, but there's actually plenty of enchantments in this format you want to mess with. Not to mention Overlords. A lot of people playing Overlords, and Lauren just blanks them, kills them, and gives you a 2/1 vigilance. So pretty good play. Kills up the beanstalks and stuff like that. Just Urbrass Forge, just all around a very main deckable card right now. Enduring Innocence is also in here and works pretty well with the Lauren because that's a 2-power creature. So good to see that sort of 1-2 combination. But this works with Archangel Elspeth, works with Biza when she gives you tokens, works with Fountain Port and Mirex and stuff. So just a Takasi is welcome with Lifelink. So it's kind of a different wrinkle against the mono red and red X decks like that Gruul deck we just looked at. Again, creature with lifelink that absorbs 1 block. Pretty decent. But apart from that, this is just kind of known as the mono red killer or the leyline killer because of the Archangels and the Bizas. You ever get to those, you gain some life. You're feeling pretty good. Enduring Innocence gains life. Sunfall wrecks their plan. Lay Down Arms wrecks their plan. Forget Lost wrecks their plan. Even the Parting Gust, which you'll see a little bit more often in this day and age. You didn't see it at the very beginning of the season, but Gust is actually a slick card against slick shots, right? Because again, they're going to load up their dudes with a bunch of pump spell. Just Parting Gust it. Don't gift them the fish. They can have their guy back, EOTs, just you're not going to hit me with him right now, and that will end their game. There's also 4 carrot cakes in this deck, which you may expect. Sometimes this deck doesn't play carrot cake, but more often than not, it does. Just good with everything that we're doing. And of course, the 4 Caretaker's Talent. So along with the Enduring Vitality, is that what it's called? We've got like 8 different ways of drawing cards as engines in this deck when we get little dudes in play. And this particular engine makes our dudes bigger later in the game, and we just kind of like alpha strike. So, Mono White has had the same plan for a while now, but it is a very good plan. I have to say, all 4 Fountain Ports, gone down to 0 Mirex here, but it's also got 4 Shadowy Backstreet, which is kind of interesting because the sideboard includes 3 Kaya Intangible Slayer. So technically an Orzhov deck here, but not really. Again, this is mostly, I think, for mirror matches and other long games. Kaya is amazing against decks that mostly have point and click removal against planeswalkers or just have a hard time dealing with planeswalkers in the first place. They don't have a lot of creatures attacking in or whatever. Kaya can just basically lock them. I think this deck is very, very strong. Now, as you can see, I put this deck at number 3. I'm giving it a pretty good shot at taking down this tournament, but that said, it hasn't been extremely popular lately. On MTGO League or in challenges, it hasn't been putting up amazing finishes, whereas just a week and a half ago, this was the deck to beat in Standard. It was kind of the deck that shifted Mono Red and Red X out of the format, or at least a little bit more than it had been. Right? It's still a real force, but Mono White really helped to combat that menace for a good while, but since then, Mono White's spot has been taken over by more mid-rangey piles, so I'm just not really sure that this is the deck to take down the tournament, but for what it's worth, I am not a Pro Tour competitor, not even close. You've seen me play Magic, but if I had to take a deck to this tournament, if they just were, hey, Dev, you want to come to play Worlds? Yes. So what I would do is embarrass myself by playing Mono White. This is the deck that I would choose all day if I was going to enter this tournament. That said, Mono White does have a sort of natural predator in this environment that has really taken over its spot over this last week, right? It won a couple of big tournaments a week or so ago, and ever since then, a lot of people have been on either Mono Black or, more likely in this case, or at least the last week or so. Golgari, mid-range, often called Golgari demons, but a lot of the green black lists don't incorporate anywhere near as many demons as the mono black lists. So these are a little bit different, but I do think the Golgari one is becoming the definitive one in standard. So let's take a look. Now, speaking of decks that there are a lot of ways to build, just like the last couple of decks we've looked at, there are so many ways to build, not just Golgari, but mono black. But again, I'm focusing on Golgari because I think it's the more versatile build. I think that it can handle more, right? And not only that, I think it's just got more sort of engines in it. You know, you've got things like Glissa Sunslayer, which may not be an engine, but it's just one of the best threats in the entire format. Same thing with Sheldra. This card is still good. Caustic Bronco can draw cards and sometimes deal a good amount of damage to our opponent. We've got Archfiend of the Dross in here because it turns out that apart from just, you know, the Unholy Annex synergy, it's good to have a 4-mana 6/6. We've got the one copy of Aclazotz you may expect to see. It is here. There's 4 Mosswood Dread Knights to draw cards. Preacher of the Schism draws cards. Sentinel of Nameless City kind of draws cards with the map tokens and stuff. Helps get your land drops and make your dudes larger. There's also Gix's Command and 1 Pillage the Bog, both silver bullets here, but both serving a really, really good purpose. And a Gix's Command can just blow up someone's entire game, and there's plenty of creatures to get back with it. If we just put lifelink counters on something and get in, that can really, really help swing the tide against aggro and whatnot. Pillage the Bog is basically find whatever card you want. It's kind of Demonic Tutor in this deck. And then a really good suite of removal. We got 4 copies of Cut Down to deal with Deep Cavern Bats and Slick Shots and all that. Monastery Swiss Pierce, Cacophony Scamps, all of it. Go for the Throat is a 3-of, and then Bitter Triumph is a 1-of to deal with occasional Planeswalkers we might see. There's also 2 Unholy Annex in this deck, which is the card draw engine. At the beginning of your end step, draw a card. If we control a demon, each opponent loses 2 life, we gain 2 life. If we don't control a demon, we lose 2 life. This also has a 6/6 demon stapled to it for just 5 mana, which is actually kind of a steal. This has been a great sort of analog in some ways to Caretaker's Talent in the white decks, right? I'll say this later in the video, but it's a 3-mana enchantment that draws cards. So I guess the green-black decks got kind of jealous of Caretaker's Talent. We're like, oh, well, we have a piece that does the same thing. Let's try that out. But Caretaker's Talent is stapled to, an enabler for going wide. A way to make all your dudes like relatively fat, even if they started as 1/1s. This just gives you 1 large man with flying, which I kind of like. This deck just has a lot of versatility to it. I would be forced to give this like an 8.5 in versatility if I was doing power rankings, because this deck can handle just about anything you throw at it. Overall, pretty easy to see why this deck is so well positioned. It's got the chops to take down a lot of the different permanent types it'll see from mono white and white X decks and stuff like that, or say Domain, or say the Overlords lists. There's a lot of different stuff that this deck has plenty of tools against. It's got a lot of great removal available to it, whether it takes out creatures or artifacts or enchantments or whatever. It's got a good spread of removal available to it while not having to play a single bad card. Also kind of funny that mono white got, a 3-mana enchantment that serves as a card draw engine in Caretaker's Talent, whereas these mono black and Golgari decks are using a 3-mana enchantment that serves as a card draw engine, Unholy Annex, and in a lot of cases, it'll draw just as many or more cards than a card like Caretaker's Talent, where you have to force a way to get tokens onto the table. That takes mana. Sometimes the only way to get a token onto the table is to like Fountain Port, and that's like 4 mana in total. It's ridiculous, right? So I would say the Unholy Annex deck not only tends to draw cards just as or even more consistently, but once it's got a demon out, it's basically another Sheldred that's making you lose 2 life and them gain 2 life every single turn, and that's a win condition in and of itself. When you look at the Golgari deck, you see a bunch of different card draw engines and some of the strongest removal options in the format, along with some of the best threats like Aclazotz and Glissa and whatnot. So, an Unholy Annex just comes stapled to a 6/6 flyer. The deck is absolutely ridiculous when it comes to mid-range piles. It is probably the king of them in Standard right now, and it looks like Standard is shifting more towards a mid-range kind of format outside, from that sort of mono-red dominant format. So with that in mind, I think this may again be the king of the mid-range decks, and it's really going to be tough to stop. So if this deck shows up, and I'm almost sure that it will, I give it a 1 in 4 chance of taking home the #1 slot, but I would be extremely surprised if this did not show up in the top 8. Our last deck today is kind of the new kid on the block, but I do think it has what it takes. Now, the one thing I'll say about this deck before I reveal what it is that even though you can probably see, just look at the deck list and the description, you'll know what it is. But either way, I think that this deck, I need to say, may be too new for Pro Tour players to have been testing it for long enough, right? You know, usually these players want to test a deck a lot, like more than just a week before an event. But that said, there could be multiple players that are already on 4-color overlords. And the best way to describe this deck is it's kind of like if Temur Doppelgang and Domain had a little baby together, because this deck is, you know, some Doppelgangs and some Overlords. No Atraxes, no herd migrations, but it does have the leyline bindings and stuff. You'll see. Let's take a look at this list. If you haven't seen it yet, I think it's actually a very strong one. This is, again, kind of a domain deck, kind of a Doppelgang deck. You see the Doppelgang here is a 2 of, but the main purpose of this is going to be copying not only Overlords, but sometimes your opponent's stuff. Right, you can copy your opponent's stuff. You can copy your Overlord of the Hauntwoods land that it gave you, and now you just got like a ton of lands that all produce whatever color you want. And then you can ramp into things like, you know, future Overlord of the Boiler Villages, future Overlord of the Hauntwoods, future Overlord of the Mistmoors. This deck plays 10 different Overlords, and these are all very powerful cards. I think the main, like, over-the-top late-game win condition here is going to be Doppelgang plus Overlord of the Boiler Villages, because if you make 3 copies of this, you probably win. You know, let's say you probably got the game in order there if you just dome them for 12 or kill all their guys and keep a bunch of 5/5s in play. There's a lot of ways to make that play work for you, but obviously these are all just huge creatures that can be played for relatively cheaply, and then if the game goes long enough, and it probably will, right, then it just wins, you know, and it's got these lines working like Overlord of the Mistmoors, impending on 4, block with a couple of guys, or maybe get in for attacks for a couple turns, and then Sunfall, and then a turn or two later, your Overlord's going to come out. You know, I really like that line with Sunfall in this deck where, like, you go ahead and impin your Overlord of the Hauntwoods on 3, you Sunfall on 4, and then, like, the next turn you get your Overlord of the Hauntwoods or whatever. These are all cool lines. Up the Beanstalk is in here because this procs off of all of the Overlords, regardless of whether or not we play them for their full cost. If we impending these, Up the Beanstalk still sees that we cast a 5-drop or greater. Right, so we'll draw a card off of Up the Beanstalk. That is insane card advantage. And then Leyline Binding will also proc Up the Beanstalk. This is kind of a domain deck, but this is the only domain card, right? There's no herd migration. There's no Atraxa, which would normally be in the deck like this. But instead, we're actually going to bring the curve down, weirdly, and not play as many Atraxas. We're going to shore up the mana base a little bit because we're kind of playing 4 colors instead of 5 in this deck like we normally would. So it's just a little bit more focused, a little bit more tight, and it draws way more cards than the average domain deck ever did. A fair number of removal spells in the deck, your big sweeper, and then huge creatures, just solid classic mid-range when you really get down to it, but it's very overwhelming and has a ton of lines that I think are, overpowered compared to your average mid-range build. So yeah, who knew that the secret to improving the Atraxa deck was to take out the Atraxas? Again, there may be some like recency bias with a deck like this, and I'm not going to give it as high of a chance as some of the other decks that we've seen today of taking home the whole cookie, but I do think this has a decent chance of at least showing up in the top 8, if nothing else. I think that it's an up-and-comer, that if some people do end up playing it, I think that not too many people are sideboarding against it specifically, maybe like a domain variant, but not this deck specifically, and I think that if it does show up, it may be one of those that the fewest number of players is on, but it doesn't mean that it can't be successful. So I'll give this, say, a 1 in 10 chance of taking home, well, less than that actually. I would give this like a 1 in 20 chance of taking home the number 1 spot, but I want to be optimistic and actually give it like a 1 out of 3 chance of top 8ing. Now, there are other decks to kind of think about in this standard. There's things like Azorius Enchantments, which is fine, Old School Domain, which is fine, and especially Dimir, whatever it is. There's like a Dimir mid-range tempo control thing. You guys know what deck I'm talking about with the Gixes and the Deep Cavern Bats and the Spyglass Sirens and the thing, right? It's some counter magic. It's a fine deck. And again, one that I would actually look out for. I think that one has a pretty good chance of top 8ing as well. But that said, there's even more decks to talk about in standard. Rakdos Lizards, there's plenty of decks out there that could show up at this thing. But again, these are the 5 that I think have the greatest chance of taking home the whole thing. But that's it for now. Just let me know in the comments section how you felt about all the ramblings and stuff. Did I completely miss a deck? Is there like some sort of secret saucy, spicy tech that you've got that you might be super simpatico with one world championship competitor and they win the whole thing and you knew the whole time? You're not crazy. So let me know down there. Just any thoughts and emotions. that you might have. And on your way out, do all the YouTube stuff. Just hit the button shaped like a thumb that will, quote, like the video. I don't even know what that means, but apparently it's beneficial. You can sub to the sandwich if you want to. I like sandwiches, especially subs. Yum, yum, yum. I need subs. But anyway, check out the Patreon. It's probably like the best thing you can do if you want to support the channel and keep this whole operation going, and the lights on and the fancy camera. I don't know. If you just want me to keep doing this, $1 a month would go an awful long way. I would appreciate it a lot. I'll leave a link in the description to Patreon if you're interested. But apart from that, I'm more or less donezo for this onezo, baby. So I'm going to get out of here and start working on other projects. I love you all very much. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.